A wealthy CEO makes an unusual offer to a struggling candy seller, proposing a life-changing agreement. But when the baby arrives, he is met with an unexpected shock. Ethan Carter was a self-made millionaire, but he had long given up on the idea of love. After years of failed relationships, he saw emotions as nothing more than a liability, something that gave others the power to hurt him. At 49, Ethan had come to a clear conclusion. He didn't need love to have what he wanted most, a child to carry on his legacy. That afternoon, as he drove through the bustling city streets, he mulled over his plan. He needed someone willing to enter into a contract, a woman who would have his child without complications, expectations, or entanglements. But where would he find someone who fit the role perfectly? Someone who wouldn't make trouble and would accept his terms? Lost in thought, he stopped at a red light, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. That's when something unusual caught his attention. A young woman weaving between cars, selling candy from a small box. Her delicate features were marked by hardship, her brown hair tied back in a messy ponytail. Her clothes, though clean, showed signs of wear, evidence of a daily struggle to survive. Yet, there was something striking about her, a resilience in her eyes that intrigued him. As she approached the car beside his, Ethan observed her carefully. She didn't seem to recognize him, nor did she appear interested in who he was. The light turned green, and he drove away, but the image of her lingered in his mind. A few blocks later, he pulled over, shaking his head at himself. This is absurd, he thought. Yet, something inside him told him to turn back. When he returned to the intersection, she was still there. Rolling down his window, he hesitated for a brief moment before calling out, "Hey, you!" She turned sharply, her expression immediately guarded. "Are you talking to me?" she asked, suspicion in her voice. "Yes, you. Are you single?" he asked bluntly. Her reaction was immediate. Her brows furrowed and her expression darkened. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp with irritation. "Who do you think you're talking to?" Ethan raised an eyebrow, unfazed by her defensive tone. "Relax, I just asked a question." She crossed her arms, glaring at him. "Look, I'm out here selling candy, not myself." Her boldness took him by surprise. He was used to people being intimidated by his presence, but this woman stood her ground. "That's not what I meant," Ethan replied, adjusting his tone to sound more composed. "I have a job offer for you, something that could change your life." She let out a short, bitter laugh. "A job? Do you think I'm stupid?" she scoffed. "Guys like you always have some kind of hidden agenda." Ethan took a deep breath, resisting the urge to lose patience. He didn't want to let the opportunity slip away. "I'm serious," he insisted. "No tricks, no lies. I just think you might be interested in what I have to offer." She narrowed her eyes, studying him carefully. "And why would I accept anything from you?" she challenged. Ethan knew he had to tread carefully. He couldn't appear weak, but he also couldn't afford to scare her off. "Because you have nothing to lose," he said plainly. "What I'm offering could change your life. And honestly, it doesn't look like you're in a position to turn down opportunities." She bit her lip, visibly irritated, but his words had hit a nerve. As much as she hated to admit it, he wasn't wrong. Selling candy at a traffic light wouldn't pay for her mother's medication or secure a better future for herself. "Fine," she said at last, crossing her arms. "But just so you know, I'm not an idiot. If this is some kind of trick, you'll regret wasting my time." "Great," Ethan said, stepping out of his car and motioning toward a nearby cafe. "Let's talk there." She hesitated for a moment, but eventually followed. Once inside, Ethan took a good look at her. Despite her worn clothing and tired face, she had a natural beauty and an undeniable strength. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lucy," she answered, her tone firm. "Lucy Scott. Now, just tell me what you want." Ethan leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. "My name is Ethan Carter." Ethan didn't waste any time. I want you to have my child, he stated plainly. Lucy blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. A child, she echoed, stunned. Is this some kind of joke? No, he replied, his tone unwavering. You heard me right. I want you to be the mother of my child. No relationship, no complications, just a straightforward agreement. I'll cover all your expenses, pay you a generous amount at the end, and that's it. Lucy stared at him, her expression shifting from shock to fury. Are you serious? Is this how you solve everything? Just throwing money at people? Ethan remained calm. Money simplifies things. No drama, no confusion. She let out a short, bitter laugh. You really think you can buy anything, don't you? Most things, yes, he replied without hesitation. Lucy shot up from her seat, arms crossed, glaring at him with disdain. Well, I'm not for sale, she snapped. You might be rich, but you're also a first-class jerk. Ethan smirked slightly. Maybe I am, but my offer still stands. She studied him, torn between anger and the harsh reality of her situation. Part of her wanted to throw his offer back in his face, but deep down, she knew she was backed into a corner. Her life was unraveling, and he could see it. Before leaving, she turned to face him once more. If I think about it, will you leave me alone? Ethan nodded and slid a business card across the table. My number's on here. Lucy hesitated before taking the card, then walked out of the cafe without looking back. She hated the thought of even considering his proposition, but she couldn't deny the weight of her circumstances. As she walked quickly through the streets of Los Angeles, she gripped the card tightly, her mind racing. One part of her wanted to tear it to shreds and forget his absurd proposal, but another part couldn't ignore the crushing reality awaiting her at home. Her tiny apartment on the outskirts of the city wasn't much of a home. It was a constant reminder of her struggles. When she stepped inside, she found her mother, Grace, sitting in an old armchair, coughing uncontrollably. The sound was raw and painful, each breath a struggle. Mom, are you okay? Lucy rushed to her side, gripping her frail hand. Grace tried to smile, but exhaustion dulled her features. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just need to rest. How was your day? Lucy hesitated. Ethan's offer flashed through her mind, but instead of mentioning it, she forced a smile. Just a regular day. She walked into the kitchen and spotted the nearly empty medicine bottles on the counter. A knot formed in her stomach. The medication was expensive, and last month's bills had already drained everything she had earned selling candy. As she washed her hands, Ethan's words crept into her thoughts. He was arrogant, cold, and clearly used to getting whatever he wanted with money. But the amount he had offered could change everything. More importantly, it could provide her mother with the medical care she desperately needed. That night, as her mother slept, Lucy sat at the kitchen table, staring at Ethan's business card. I would never do something like this, she told herself. But the image of her mother gasping for breath, the mounting pile of unpaid bills, it all made her hesitate. She collapsed onto her bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, torn between pride and desperation. By morning, she had made up her mind. With trembling fingers, she dialed the number on the card. The phone rang twice before a steady, controlled voice answered. Ethan Carter. Lucy swallowed hard. It's Lucy. Lucy Scott. A brief silence followed before Ethan responded, his tone laced with satisfaction. I was hoping you'd call. Don't get ahead of yourself, she warned, her voice sharp with distrust. I need to know more before I make any decisions. Ethan agreed to meet her at the same cafe that afternoon. When Lucy arrived, he was already seated, a folder in front of him, his posture composed and confident. I didn't think you'd call, he said as she sat down. I almost didn't, Lucy admitted, crossing her arms. But I need to know exactly what you're proposing. Without hesitation, Ethan opened the folder and slid a contract toward her. These are the terms, he said. You'll have full medical and financial support throughout the pregnancy. You'll stay in a comfortable place, have access to everything you need, and at the end, you'll receive $500,000. Lucy blinked, stunned by the amount. It was enough to pay for all of her mother's treatments, clear every debt, and even start a new life. "And what do you want in return?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "A child, an heir," Ethan stated, matter-of-factly. "Once the baby is born, you'll have no responsibility. All parental rights will be mine, and you'll walk away." Lucy picked up the contract and started reading. Every clause felt colder and more calculated than the last. It controlled everything: medical checkups, diet, lifestyle, down to the smallest detail. "This is so impersonal," she muttered, looking up at him. "That's how I prefer things," Ethan replied without hesitation. Lucy closed the contract and placed it back on the table. "Do you really think you can buy people like they're objects?" Ethan leaned back, arms crossed, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not buying you, Lucy. I'm offering a business agreement. And in business, everything has clear terms." "Oh, and of course you get to set all the rules," she shot back, her frustration rising. "It's not an obligation, it's a choice," he said calmly. "You're here because you wanted to hear what I had to say, and you know that I'm offering something no one else can." Lucy fell silent, his words echoing in her mind. She hated to admit it, but he was right. This was an opportunity unlike any other. "I need time to think," she said, pushing back her chair. Ethan nodded. "Don't take too long. This offer won't last forever." Lucy walked out of the cafe, gripping the contract in her hands, her mind spinning. On one side, his proposal seemed like the answer to all her problems. On the other, it required giving up something she wasn't sure she could live with. Now, let's play a little game for those who only read the comments. Type "pizza" below. Only those who've made it this far will understand. Now, back to the story. When Lucy got home, she found her mother, Grace, lying on the couch, coughing again. She hurried over, gently stroking her mother's hair, pushing aside the weight of her decision. "Are you okay, Mom?" she asked, trying to hide her concern. Grace smiled, though her breathing was still labored. "I'm fine. I just worry about you. You've been carrying too much for my sake." Lucy felt a lump in her throat, but quickly looked away. "Don't worry about me. I'll figure it out." Grace took her hand, as if sensing the silent burden Lucy carried. "You deserve better, my dear. Don't let anyone take that away from you." That night, Lucy sat at the kitchen table, reading through Ethan's contract over and over. Each clause felt heavier than the last. But the image of her mother, the growing stack of medical bills, was stronger. Ethan was cold, calculating, and used to getting what he wanted. But maybe, just maybe, he was her only way out. Lucy gripped her phone tightly, her heart pounding as she dialed his number. The ringing felt deafening. When his voice finally came through, firm and emotionless, she took a shaky breath. "Ethan Carter," he answered. "It's Lucy," she said, her voice slightly uncertain. A brief pause. Then, with a tone of quiet certainty, he replied, "I assume you've made a decision." Lucy clenched her jaw. His confidence annoyed her, but she forced herself to stay focused. "I want to discuss the details." Ethan agreed to meet her the next morning, this time at his office. When Lucy arrived, a wave of nervousness washed over her. The building was towering, a skyscraper that seemed to disappear into the clouds. The pristine marble lobby gleamed under the bright lights, making her feel even smaller. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. Lucy felt completely out of place. As she stepped into Ethan's office, she found him seated behind a massive glass desk overlooking the city skyline. He exuded the same distant, calculating energy as before, but there was something else in his gaze. A cold determination that was unshakable. "I'm glad you came," he said bluntly, gesturing toward the chair in front of him. Lucy sat down, crossing her arms. Let's get straight to the point, Ethan. I need some guarantees before I sign anything. He raised an eyebrow, slightly surprised by her firm tone, but he didn't seem bothered. Of course, I'm here to answer any questions you have. Lucy took a deep breath and unfolded the contract she had brought with her. First, my mother. She needs medical care, and that has to be part of the deal. I want you to cover all her treatments while I'm pregnant. Ethan leaned forward slightly, analyzing her. That wasn't in the original contract, he admitted, but I can agree to it. Your mother will receive all the medical care she needs. Lucy nodded, but didn't relax. Second, I need assurance that you won't change the terms later. I don't want any surprises halfway through. Ethan sighed, his patience slightly thinning. Lucy, I'm a businessman. When I sign an agreement, I stick to it. Everything will be documented and legally binding. There's nothing to worry about. She studied him for a moment, trying to determine if he was being sincere. There was something about him that made her uneasy, but at the same time, his confidence was difficult to doubt. And where will I be living? She asked. Ethan opened a drawer and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the desk. One of my properties. It's secure, comfortable, and fully equipped with everything you'll need. I want you to be in the best environment possible for a smooth pregnancy. Lucy picked up the envelope and glanced at the photos. The house was unlike anything she had ever seen. Spacious, elegant, and far beyond what she was used to. And what if I don't adjust? She asked, lifting her gaze to meet his. Ethan sighed, leaning back. Lucy, this isn't just some casual arrangement. I'm offering you a way out of your current situation, a chance for you and your mother to have a better future. But if you don't think you can commit, we can end this conversation right now. His cold, matter-of-fact tone irritated her, but she couldn't argue with his logic. She knew she couldn't afford to walk away from this opportunity. Taking a deep breath, she reached for the pen on the table. Fine, I'll do it. Ethan watched as she signed the contract. Once she finished, he took the papers, checked the signatures, and locked them away in the safe behind his desk. Welcome to the agreement, Lucy, he said, extending his hand. She stared at it for a moment before shaking it. His grip was firm, but not as cold as she had expected. That afternoon, a driver escorted Lucy to her new home. When she arrived, she was speechless. The house was breathtaking. A 2-story mansion with meticulously landscaped gardens. Every detail inside was refined, the furniture elegant yet inviting. At the entrance, a woman greeted her with a warm smile. Lucy, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm Stephanie, Mr. Carter's personal assistant. I'll be here to help with anything you need. Lucy returned the smile, though she still felt out of place. Thank you. Stephanie gave her a tour of the house, showing her every luxurious corner, including the master bedroom, which looked like something straight out of a designer magazine. Lucy wasn't sure whether to feel grateful or overwhelmed. It was too much, too different from the life she had known. In the days that followed, Lucy slowly adjusted to her new reality. Doctors hired by Ethan conducted thorough medical exams, preparing her for the next steps. Everything was handled with precision and efficiency. Despite the kindness from Stephanie and the medical staff, Lucy couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, monitored like a piece of property. As expected, Ethan remained distant. He only appeared when necessary, to review reports about her health and ensure everything was proceeding as planned. One evening, as Lucy wandered into the living room, she unexpectedly ran into him. He was seated, reviewing documents, but paused when he noticed her. "How are you settling in?" he asked, not looking up from his papers. Lucy hesitated before responding. "It's different," she admitted cautiously. "I still feel like I don't belong here." Ethan finally looked up. "You don't have to feel that way. This is all part of the agreement. I want you to be comfortable." She let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "Comfortable? It's hard to feel comfortable when my entire life is out of my control." Ethan leaned back in his chair, as if considering her words. "I understand that this might feel strange to you, but remember, this was your choice. No one forced you into this." Lucy's frustration flared. "Do you think it was an easy choice? You wouldn't understand, Ethan. You've never had to make decisions out of pure desperation. You only know what it's like to be in control." A heavy silence settled between them. Ethan adjusted his tie and stood up. Before leaving, he said, "Maybe you're right, Lucy, but control is the only thing that never fails." She watched as he walked away, feeling a storm of emotions, frustration, anger, and something else she couldn't quite name. Ethan was so distant, so incapable of seeing beyond his own carefully controlled world. That night, Lucy retreated to her room, staring out the window. The mansion was silent, almost suffocating in its stillness, yet it symbolized an opportunity she had never imagined having. Her mother's face came to mind, and Lucy reminded herself why she was here. No matter how difficult it was to deal with Ethan, she would endure it for her mother. The next morning, Lucy was jolted awake by the alarm Stephanie had set the night before. She still wasn't used to the oversized bed or the luxurious softness of the sheets. The unfamiliar surroundings felt foreign, though she tried convincing herself that she was adjusting. That day, another round of medical tests awaited her. Since signing the contract, her life had been governed by strict schedules, clinical procedures, and an unspoken expectation that everything would go exactly as planned. Though it hadn't been explicitly stated, Lucy knew Ethan expected no complications. After breakfast prepared by professional chefs, an unsettling feeling settled in her chest. The spacious kitchen, equipped with gleaming high-end appliances, was a stark contrast to the tiny apartment where she and her mother had once shared a single loaf of bread for breakfast. While waiting for Stephanie to pick her up for the appointment, Lucy wandered through the mansion. Each room was bigger than her entire old apartment. The place radiated wealth, but to her, it felt cold, empty, lacking any real warmth. When Stephanie arrived, Lucy followed her to the sleek black car parked in the driveway. On the way to the clinic, Stephanie attempted small talk, but Lucy responded with short, uninterested replies. She wasn't in the mood for conversation. At the clinic, the doctors walked her through the next phase. The fertilization procedure was approaching, and the weight of that reality pressed down on her. She had understood the agreement from the beginning, but now, the thought of carrying Ethan Carter's child felt suddenly overwhelming, frighteningly real. Back at the mansion, Lucy was surprised to find Ethan sitting in the living room. It was rare to see him there. He was reviewing documents, but glanced up as soon as she entered. "How was the appointment?" he asked, his tone neutral. Lucy crossed her arms. "Everything is going according to plan," she replied. "Just like you wanted." Ethan shrugged. "That's how things should be. A solid plan eliminates mistakes." Lucy let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Of course, because you never make mistakes, right?" Ethan's jaw tightened, clearly irritated by her sarcasm. "I prefer to leave no room for mistakes. That's different." Shaking her head in disbelief, Lucy scoffed. "You really think you can control everything, don't you? Even someone else's pregnancy?" Ethan closed the file he was reading and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I control what I can," he said. "That's how I got to where I am." "And does that make you happy?" Lucy asked, without hesitation. A heavy silence filled the room. Ethan maintained his usual serious expression, but for a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes, something uncertain. Without answering, he stood, gathered his documents, and left the room. Lucy sighed, feeling like the conversation had gone nowhere. She already knew Ethan was a cold, calculating man, but there was something about him she couldn't quite understand. Beneath his unshakable control, there was an emptiness, a void that in some ways mirrored her own. In the days that followed, that thought lingered in her mind. Lucy slowly adapted to her new routine. Daily medical checkups, constant care, and extravagant dinners prepared by the mansion's staff became her new normal. Yet, despite the comfort, she felt isolated. One evening as she wandered through the vast house, she came across a locked door at the end of a hallway. Unlike the others, this one was more solid, its lock appearing rarely used. Curiosity got the better of her and she tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The next day, she casually asked Stephanie about it. "That's Mr. Carter's private office," the assistant explained cautiously. "He keeps important things in there. No one is allowed in without his permission." Lucy could tell there was more to the story, but she let it go, for now. A few days later, Ethan unexpectedly joined her for dinner. It was rare for him to be home at this hour. Though he looked exhausted, he maintained his usual poised demeanor. As they ate, Lucy decided to make conversation, partly out of boredom, partly out of curiosity. "Do you work all the time?" she asked while cutting into her meal. Ethan looked up, slightly caught off guard by the question. "Pretty much." "That must be exhausting," she commented, trying to sound casual. "It's necessary," he replied flatly. Lucy shook her head. "You talk like life is only about work. Don't you think something's missing?" Ethan paused for a moment, as if considering his answer. "I had different priorities once. Now, this is enough." Lucy caught something hidden in his words, something unspoken. But instead of pressing, she shifted the conversation. "Are you always like this?" she asked. "Everything has to be controlled?" Ethan gave a small, humorless smile. "I don't see anything wrong with wanting things to go as planned." Lucy chuckled. "And what happens when things don't go as planned? What do you do then?" His jaw tensed slightly, his expression unreadable. "I don't let that happen." That was the end of the conversation, but Lucy sensed there was more beneath the surface, a side of Ethan he was determined to keep buried. That night, she stood on her bedroom balcony, staring at the distant city lights. The mansion was silent, almost suffocating in its stillness. Despite all the luxury, Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong here. Her thoughts drifted to her mother. She imagined Grace sitting alone in their tiny apartment, unaware of how much Lucy missed her. This was all for her, yet with each passing day, the distance between them felt heavier. As she gazed at the horizon, lost in thought, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Ethan standing in the doorway. "I didn't realize you were still up," he said. "I can't sleep," Lucy admitted. Ethan stepped closer, joining her on the balcony. "It's strange being here, isn't it?" he asked, his tone softer than usual. Lucy turned to him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "You have no idea." For a moment they stood in silence, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Lucy sensed a subtle shift in the air, as if, for just a brief moment, Ethan was letting his guard down. "Maybe you're right," he finally said, breaking the silence. "Right about what?" Ethan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "About life? Not being just about control." Lucy studied him, trying to understand the weight behind his words, but before she could respond, he stepped away. "Good night, Lucy," he said, before disappearing into the shadows of the mansion. She remained on the balcony, staring at the sky. For the first time, she felt that Ethan might be changing, even if just a little. The news hit Lucy like a wave. Stephanie's voice on the phone had been calm, but Lucy could barely process the words. The fertilization had been successful. The doctor wanted to confirm the pregnancy. She had known this was the goal all along, but now that it was real, it felt overwhelming, terrifying. Hanging up, Lucy sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling. She was carrying Ethan Carter's child, a man she barely knew. A man who seemed incapable of real emotion. The weight of that reality pressed down on her like never before. Trying to steady herself, she left for the doctor's office that afternoon, Stephanie by her side. The confirmation came during the ultrasound. "You're pregnant," the doctor said, pointing at the small flicker on the screen. "Everything looks perfect." Lucy stared at the monitor, at the tiny dot that marked the beginning of a life. A flood of emotions crashed over her. Relief, fear, and, unexpectedly, the faintest glimmer of hope. But when she returned to the mansion, any sense of calm disappeared. Ethan was waiting for her in the main hall, his usual composed expression in place. "Stephanie told me you went to the doctor today," he said, ever direct. Lucy folded her arms, already bracing for his cold, businesslike reaction. "Yes, I'm pregnant. Go ahead, celebrate. Your plan is working." Ethan ignored her sarcasm, though something in his posture seemed different. He gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, her defiance unwavering. "I want to discuss a few things," he said, keeping his voice measured. "Of course you do," Lucy replied, letting out a dry laugh. "Everything has to go exactly the way you want, doesn't it?" Ethan exhaled slowly, clearly trying to keep his patience. "This isn't about control, Lucy. It's about making sure everything goes well, for the child's sake." She narrowed her eyes. "The child, that's all it is to you? Just another piece in your carefully constructed world?" Ethan stood, his imposing presence filling the space, but Lucy didn't back down. "I don't expect you to understand my reasons," he said, his voice colder now. "But everything I do is to ensure this child's future." Lucy let out an exasperated sigh. "You act like this is some noble act, Ethan. But in the end, this is about you, your need for control, your ego." Ethan's eyes darkened. "Then why did you agree to this?" he countered. "If this is so unbearable, why are you still here?" His words hit her like a slap. She knew why, but hearing it from him made her anger and guilt rise to the surface. "I'm here because of my mother," she said, her voice shaking. "Because she's sick, because I didn't have any other choice." A thick silence settled between them. Ethan watched her, and for a moment it seemed like he wanted to say something, but whatever words he had never came. The tension between them only grew in the days that followed. Ethan kept his distance, but he never missed a medical appointment or a meeting with the specialists. He remained as controlled and methodical as ever. Meanwhile, Lucy felt suffocated. The mansion, which once seemed luxurious, now felt like a gilded cage. Every step she took was monitored. Every decision she tried to make was questioned, or worse, overridden by Ethan's rules. One afternoon, desperate for a sense of normalcy, Lucy walked into the kitchen and grabbed some bread, determined to make herself a simple sandwich. Just as she was about to start, Ethan entered. He frowned. "What are you doing?" Lucy looked up, unimpressed. "What does it look like? Making a sandwich." Lucy didn't look up as she answered. "Making a sandwich." Ethan crossed his arms. "There are chefs hired for that." She placed the knife down on the counter and turned to face him. "So now I can't even make my own food?" "That's not it," he said with a shrug. "I just think you should focus on resting and leave the other tasks to the people hired for that." Lucy let out a dry laugh. "You don't understand independence, do you, Ethan? I've spent my whole life doing things for myself, and now you expect me to let someone else handle even the simplest things?" Ethan was silent for a moment before finally responding. "I just want what's best for you and the baby." "The best for the baby or the best for you?" she shot back, her gaze challenging. Ethan didn't answer immediately, but his expression shifted slightly, as if her words had struck a nerve. "Lucy, I'm not your enemy," he said, his tone calmer than usual. "I want this to work, for both of us." She stared at him, searching for sincerity in his words, then shook her head. "Then maybe start treating me like a person, not just a piece of your plan." Ethan said nothing, but the silence between them felt heavier than any argument they had ever had. That night, Lucy sat on the balcony, staring at the stars. The weight of her choices felt heavier than ever. She had done all of this for her mother, but the cost was starting to feel unbearable. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. "Lucy?" Stephanie's voice carried through the quiet night. "May I come in?" "Sure," Lucy said, waving her over. Stephanie stepped onto the balcony, her expression warm and understanding. "I know this hasn't been easy for you." Lucy let out a tired sigh. "That's an understatement." Stephanie hesitated before adding, "Believe it or not, Mr. Carter cares. He just has a different way of showing it." Lucy scoffed. "Yeah, well, he has a terrible way of showing it." Stephanie gave a small smile. "He's more complicated than he seems, but if I may say so, I think he's trying." Lucy stayed quiet, mulling over Stephanie's words. Maybe there was more to Ethan than what she saw. But it was hard to look past the coldness he wrapped himself in. The next morning, as Lucy was heading out for another doctor's appointment, Ethan appeared in the hallway. "Can I come with you today?" he asked. She frowned, surprised. "Since when do you ask for permission to do anything?" A rare smirk touched his lips. "I'm trying to follow your advice." She couldn't help but let out a small chuckle. "Well, in that case, let's go." Lucy sat in the waiting room, anxiously bouncing her leg. Ethan sat beside her, scrolling through his phone, seemingly unaffected by the moment. It was her first appointment since confirming the pregnancy, and she was trying to stay calm, but the realization of how fast everything was changing made her stomach turn. "Are you going to put that down at some point?" she asked, glancing at Ethan, who was still typing away. Without looking up, he replied, "I'm handling something important." Lucy rolled her eyes. "Of course, because nothing is more important than work." Before Ethan could respond, a nurse appeared in the doorway and called Lucy's name. She stood up, and to her surprise, Ethan followed her inside. The room was quiet, except for the hum of the medical equipment. As the doctor started the ultrasound, Lucy's heart pounded. The image on the screen was small, barely formed, but it was real. Then came the sound. A steady, rhythmic heartbeat filled the room. Lucy inhaled sharply, emotions colliding within her. Fear, awe, and something entirely unexpected: connection. Beside her, Ethan stood frozen, his eyes locked on the screen. His usual composed expression was unreadable, but for the first time, he seemed almost human. "That's the baby's heartbeat," the doctor said with a smile. Lucy glanced at Ethan, half expecting a dismissive remark, but he remained quiet. His gaze stayed fixed on the screen, as if absorbing something he hadn't prepared for. As they left the clinic, Ethan finally broke the silence. "It's strange," he murmured. Lucy looked at him. "What is?" He hesitated for a second before saying, "Hearing the heartbeat. It makes everything feel real." Ethan hesitated before answering. Lucy was caught off guard. She hadn't expected that from him, the man who treated everything like a business transaction. "Well, it is real, Ethan," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. "A lot more real than any contract you've ever signed." He didn't reply, but his silence spoke volumes. Back at the mansion, Lucy tried to process everything she had felt at the doctor's office. Seeing the ultrasound, hearing the heartbeat, it had stirred something deep inside her. A sense of responsibility, a protective instinct she hadn't anticipated. As she wandered through the garden, Stephanie approached with a gentle smile. "How was the appointment?" she asked. Lucy hesitated before answering. "It was intense. Seeing the baby for the first time was different than I imagined." Stephanie nodded knowingly. "It changes things, doesn't it? even in the most unexpected circumstances. Lucy sighed, staring at the horizon. It's strange. I agreed to this for someone else, but now I can't help feeling something for this baby. Stephanie placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. That's natural, Lucy. No matter how you got here, you're human. It's impossible not to feel a connection. Lucy nodded, but the weight of her emotions only grew heavier. That evening, as she sat on her balcony, lost in thought, she heard footsteps behind her. "Ethan, you have a habit of showing up when I least expect it," she said, glancing at him. He shrugged. "I thought we could talk." Lucy raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. "Talk? That's new." Ignoring her remark, Ethan took a seat in the chair next to hers. He exhaled, staring at the night sky before finally speaking. "Today, at the doctor's office, it was strange for me," he admitted. "I never thought hearing a heartbeat would affect me the way it did." Lucy studied him, trying to read between the lines. "Because you always want to control everything," she said. Ethan turned to her, his expression less guarded than usual. "Maybe you're right, but that doesn't make it any easier." Lucy gave a faint smile. "No one said it would be easy." For once, the silence between them wasn't tense or uncomfortable. It was something different, something that felt like understanding. In the following days, Lucy noticed a subtle shift in Ethan. He still wasn't the warmest person, but he made an effort. He started attending her medical appointments without being prompted. He asked how she was doing, not in a businesslike manner, but as if he genuinely wanted to know. One afternoon, while walking through the garden, she spotted him sitting on a bench, reading through a report. To her surprise, when he looked up, he smiled. "What?" she asked, skeptical. "Nothing," he replied. "I was just thinking, you seem more comfortable here than before." Lucy crossed her arms, unsure how to respond. "I wouldn't say comfortable, but I think I'm getting used to it." Ethan closed the report and met her gaze. "I know this isn't easy for you," he said, "but I want you to know I'm trying to do the best I can." Lucy was caught off guard by his honesty. "You really are trying, aren't you?" Ethan met her gaze and nodded. "Yes." She sat down beside him, looking out at the horizon. "Maybe you're not as unbearable as I thought." Ethan chuckled, a rare sound that made Lucy pause. It was genuine, almost warm. "And maybe you're stronger than I expected," he replied. The moment was brief but significant. For the first time, Lucy felt like she was beginning to see the man behind Ethan Carter's carefully constructed facade. Later that evening, Lucy was in the kitchen, warming a cup of tea, when she heard footsteps behind her. Ethan. It was unusual to see him there, especially in such an informal setting. He looked more relaxed than usual, his crisp suits replaced with a simple white shirt, sleeves rolled up, no tie in sight. "I didn't think you even knew where the kitchen was," Lucy said, smirking as she took a sip of her tea. Ethan shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Very funny. I just came for some coffee." Lucy watched as he poured himself a cup, intrigued by how different he seemed in that moment. Less like a CEO, more like a regular person. "You seem different." Noted. Ethan let out a quiet laugh, another rarity that caught her by surprise. Even I need a break sometimes. Lucy raised an eyebrow. "You? Taking a break? That's new." He leaned against the counter, staring down at his coffee. "Sometimes I feel like my life is a machine I built myself, and now I don't know how to turn it off." The confession was so unexpected that Lucy found herself momentarily speechless. "Then why don't you try shutting it down for a while?" she asked, softly. Ethan shrugged, as if the idea was impossible. "Because if I stop, who's to say everything won't fall apart?" Lucy studied him carefully. For the first time, she felt like she was seeing the real Ethan, the man behind the rigid control and perfection, someone carrying a burden far heavier than she had imagined. "Have you always been like this?" she asked. "Always needing to control everything?" Ethan hesitated, as if weighing whether or not to answer. Finally, he sighed and turned toward the window. "My childhood was complicated," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "My father was a hard man, cold, demanding. Nothing I did was ever good enough for him." Lucy felt a pang of sympathy at his words. "That explains a lot," she murmured. Ethan continued, as if he hadn't heard her. "When my mother died, I was 14. She was the only one who ever tried to protect me from him. After she was gone, things got worse." Lucy set her teacup down on the counter and stepped closer. "And so you decided that to survive, you had to be perfect, didn't you?" Ethan looked at her, surprised by how accurately she had read him. "Yes," he admitted. "I guess I did." A quiet moment passed between them as Lucy processed everything he had just shared. "Ethan," she said gently, "you don't have to be like him. You can be different." Ethan turned away slightly, as if unsure how to respond. "Maybe," he said softly before leaving the kitchen. For days after that conversation, Lucy couldn't stop thinking about it. For the first time, she felt like she truly understood Ethan Carter. He wasn't just a cold, calculating businessman. There were layers to him, pain and fear hidden beneath the surface. And yet, despite the vulnerability he had shown that night, he still kept his distance. He made sure to attend all her medical appointments, stayed involved in every detail of the pregnancy, but he never let his emotions slip through again. Until one afternoon, Lucy was reading in the garden when she saw him approaching. He looked hesitant, almost uncomfortable, as if he were debating whether or not to say something. "Lucy," he said finally, stopping a few feet away. "Can I sit?" She closed her book, curious. Of course. Ethan sat beside her on the bench, but for a moment he said nothing. He simply stared at the horizon, deep in thought. Finally, he exhaled. "I've been thinking about what you said in the kitchen," he admitted. "About being different." "Different from your father?" Lucy asked. He nodded. "It's never been easy for me to admit, but I'm afraid." Lucy didn't say anything. She simply waited for him to continue. "I'm afraid I'm not good enough, afraid of making mistakes, and now, afraid of being a father." Lucy felt a lump in her throat. It was the first time Ethan had spoken about the baby in a way that wasn't clinical or detached. "Every parent is afraid, Ethan," she said gently. "That's normal." Ethan looked at her, a rare vulnerability in his eyes. "But what if I'm like him? What if I don't know how to be a good father?" Without thinking, Lucy placed her hand over his. The gesture was instinctive, sincere. "You're already different from him," she said softly. "The fact that you even care about this makes you a better father than he ever was." Ethan didn't respond, but she could tell her words had struck something deep within him. As the pregnancy progressed, Lucy began to notice subtle but undeniable changes in Ethan. He was more present, not just physically, but emotionally. He asked how she was feeling, took genuine interest during ultrasounds, and even brought up ideas for the baby's nursery. One afternoon, as they looked at nursery designs, Lucy couldn't help but smirk. "I never thought I'd see you debating over wall colors," she teased. Ethan chuckled, something that was becoming more common between them. "Neither did I." She realized then that she was starting to enjoy his company. He was still intense, still had his need for control, but now she could see glimpses of the man underneath the carefully built walls. One evening, while organizing baby clothes in her room, Lucy spotted a small wooden box on top of the dresser. She didn't recognize it. Curious, she opened it. Inside was a photograph. Ethan, as a young boy, standing beside a woman, his mother. They were both smiling, a rare moment of warmth captured in time. He looked so different, so unguarded. Just as she was about to set it back down, Ethan walked in. He froze when he saw her holding the photo. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice unexpectedly tense. "It was up here," Lucy said, watching him carefully. "I didn't know you kept something like this." Ethan took the photo from her and stared at it for a long moment. "My mother meant everything to me," he said quietly. "She was the only one who ever really understood me." Lucy felt a tightness in her chest, at the pain in his voice. "You still miss her, don't you?" Ethan nodded but said nothing more. At that moment, Lucy realized that no matter how much control Ethan tried to exert over his life, there were still scars he hadn't healed from. The next morning, Lucy walked into the living room, still thinking about their conversation the night before. There was something different about Ethan. She couldn't deny that she was starting to see him in a new light. As she stepped into the room, she was met with an unexpected sight. Ethan stood beside Stephanie, surrounded by several open boxes spread across the table. "What's all this?" Lucy asked, frowning. Ethan glanced at her and motioned for her to come closer. "These are things for the baby's room," he said, as if it were obvious. Lucy was momentarily speechless. "You bought all of this?" Ethan shrugged, as if downplaying the gesture. "I figured it was time to start getting everything ready." She picked up a small, soft blanket, patterned with tiny stars. It was such a simple thing, yet it carried an unexpected emotional weight. "This is unexpected," she admitted with a small smile. "I want the baby to have everything it needs," Ethan explained, his voice carrying an almost defensive edge, as if justifying his actions. Stephanie quietly excused herself, leaving them alone. Lucy watched as Ethan carefully went through the rest of the items: clothes, toys, even a crib that was still in its box, waiting to be assembled. "You've really thought of everything," she said, examining a tiny pair of baby shoes. "I don't do things halfway," Ethan replied with a faint smirk. Lucy laughed. "Yeah, I've noticed." They spent the morning unpacking and organizing the baby's things, discussing where everything would go in the nursery. For the first time, Lucy felt like they were working together, not just following one of Ethan's meticulously structured plans. Later that afternoon, Lucy took a walk through the garden, needing to clear her mind. She hadn't realized how much things had changed between them. Ethan appeared at her side, walking in step with her. "Are you okay?" he asked after a moment. "I'm fine," Lucy said, gazing out at the horizon. "It's just, there's a lot to process." Ethan nodded, his hands in his pockets. "I know all of this feels surreal, but I want you to know, I'm trying to do what's best, for you and the baby." Lucy turned to him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You've changed a lot since this all started, Ethan." He let out a small laugh. "I think you've changed too." Lucy smiled, but said nothing. For the first time, she wasn't sure she needed to say anything at all. Lucy knew he was right. The pregnancy, living with Ethan, everything was changing her in ways she didn't fully understand yet. That evening, she went to the kitchen for a snack and found Ethan sitting alone at the table, a glass of wine in his hand. It was rare to see him this relaxed, and it piqued her curiosity. "Are you okay?" she asked, taking a sip of water. Ethan glanced up at her and offered a faint smile. "Just thinking." Lucy sat across from him, studying his expression. "About what?" He swirled the wine in his glass, looking thoughtful. "About how much has changed since this all started." Lucy raised an eyebrow. "And what's your conclusion?" Ethan took a deep breath before answering. "That no matter how much I plan, I can't control everything." Lucy chuckled, shaking her head. "I think you're finally starting to understand what I've been trying to tell you all along." Ethan gave her a small smile. Maybe you're right. The moment was brief, but meaningful. For someone like Ethan, acknowledging that not everything in life could be anticipated or controlled was a significant step. In the days that followed, Ethan became even more involved in preparing for the baby's arrival. He accompanied Lucy to appointments, helped finalize details for the nursery, and even suggested hiring a photographer to document the pregnancy. One afternoon, while Lucy rested on the couch, Ethan walked into the room with a book in hand. "What's that?" she asked, intrigued. "A book about parenting," he replied, sitting down beside her. Lucy laughed. "You, reading a book on how to be a dad? Never thought I'd see the day." "Neither did I," he admitted with a faint smirk. She took the book and flipped through a few pages. "Looks like you're really taking this seriously." "I am. I want to do this right." Lucy fell silent for a moment, watching him. For the first time, she felt like she could trust that Ethan wasn't just a cold, calculating businessman. He was someone who wanted to be a good father. That night, as she was getting ready for bed, Lucy received a text from Stephanie. "Ethan has something planned for you tomorrow. Be ready." Curious, she wondered what he was up to. The next morning, Lucy was taken to a small photography studio in Los Angeles. Ethan was already waiting outside, a reserved smile on his face. "What are we doing here?" she asked, skeptical. "I wanted you to have something to remember this experience by," he explained. Lucy hesitated, but eventually agreed. During the photo session, Ethan surprised her by suggesting he join in for a few pictures. "Seriously? You want to be in the photos?" she asked, genuinely shocked. "Why not?" "It's important," he replied simply. Lucy smiled and nodded. As they posed, she noticed something different about him. He seemed more at ease, more present in the moment. At the end of the session, as they reviewed the photos on the monitor, Lucy couldn't help but smile. "I think this was a good idea," she admitted. Ethan nodded. "Maybe I have good ideas every now and then." Lucy chuckled, shaking her head. "Maybe." The next morning, Lucy woke up early, feeling the baby move more strongly than ever before. It was an unfamiliar but exciting sensation. Smiling to herself, she placed a hand on her belly, her mind drifting back over everything that had happened in the past few months. Her relationship with Ethan had shifted in ways she never expected. But there was still something about him, about the way he handled things, that kept her on edge. She headed downstairs to the kitchen, where she found Ethan sipping coffee and reading the newspaper. He glanced up as she walked in, his expression neutral, though there was something in his eyes she couldn't quite decipher. "Good morning," he said, setting the newspaper aside. "Good morning," Lucy replied, pouring herself a glass of juice. Ethan watched her carefully. "How are you feeling?" Lucy hesitated before answering. "Good, actually. I felt the baby move this morning. It was different." Ethan raised his eyebrows, genuinely interested. "Really? What was it like?" She gave a small smile, surprised by his curiosity. "Strange, but good. I think it's starting to feel more real." Ethan nodded, seeming lost in thought for a moment before shifting gears. "Stephanie scheduled another ultrasound this week. I want to make sure everything is on track." Lucy noticed that he was more involved than ever. He seemed determined to make sure everything went perfectly, but deep down, she wondered, was this really about the baby, or was it about his need for control? Later that day, Lucy's phone rang. It was the hospital. Her mother had been admitted again. Panic gripped her as she quickly gathered her things. Ethan walked in just as she grabbed her bag. "What's wrong?" he asked, noticing the worry on her face. "My mom's in the hospital," Lucy said without looking at him. "I need to get there now." "I'll go with you," Ethan said, firmly. Lucy stopped, surprised. "You don't have to. I can handle this on my own." but Ethan had already grabbed his car keys. "I'm not asking. Let's go." She didn't have time to argue. Within minutes, they were on their way to the hospital. They found Grace resting in a modest hospital room. Lucy hurried to her bedside, gently taking her mother's hand. "Mom, I'm here," she said softly. Grace slowly opened her eyes, a weak smile forming when she saw Lucy. "Are you okay, sweetheart? And the baby?" "We're fine, Mom. Don't worry about that right now." Ethan stood silently nearby, watching the exchange. He seemed out of place, as if unsure how to act in such an emotional setting. When the doctor entered, his expression was serious. He explained that Grace's condition had worsened and would require more intensive care. Lucy felt her heart sink. Before she could even ask about the cost, Ethan stepped in. "Make sure she gets the best possible treatment. Cost isn't an issue," he said firmly. Lucy turned to him, both surprised and deeply grateful. "Thank you, Ethan," she said sincerely. He simply nodded, as if brushing it off. In the days that followed, Lucy divided her time between the hospital and the mansion. Ethan accompanied her whenever he could, and gradually she began to see him in a new light. He wasn't just the cold, calculating man she had met at the beginning. He was showing a different side, a human side. One evening, as they sat in the hospital waiting room, Lucy glanced at Ethan, who was reading a report on his tablet. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, breaking the silence. Ethan looked up. "Doing what?" "Helping my mom. You didn't have to." Ethan sighed and set the tablet down. "Because it's the right thing to do." Lucy narrowed her eyes. "You're not the kind of person who does things just because they're the right thing to do." Ethan let out a soft chuckle, though there was a hint of bitterness in it. "Maybe I'm trying to be someone different," he admitted, looking straight at her. Lucy didn't know how to respond. She simply sat there, warmth spreading through her chest in a way she hadn't expected. A week later, Grace was discharged and sent home. Though still weak, she was improving. Ethan had arranged for a private nurse to assist her, a gesture that touched Lucy deeply, even though she tried to hide it. That evening, over dinner, Ethan asked a question that caught Lucy completely off guard. "What do you want to do after the baby's born?" Lucy paused mid-bite, setting down her fork. "What do you mean?" Ethan leaned back slightly, folding his hands on the table. "I want to know what your plans are." Lucy hesitated, a tightness forming in her chest. "I don't know," she admitted. "I guess I haven't thought that far ahead." "Maybe you should," Ethan said calmly. Lucy studied him for a moment, then carefully asked, "And what about you? Have you decided what you're going to do about the baby?" Ethan was silent for a moment before answering. "I'm still figuring it out." Lucy's stomach twisted at his vague response. "You talk about it like it's just another business decision," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's not," he said firmly. "But I need to think about what's best for him." For the first time, Lucy felt a deep fear settle inside her. She had no idea what would happen once the baby arrived. The next day, as they worked on setting up the nursery, Lucy finally confronted him. "What do you really want, Ethan?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. Ethan stopped what he was doing and turned to her. "I want to make sure he has the best future possible." "That's not an answer," she countered. "Do you actually want to be in his life? Or do you just want to make sure he has everything he needs from a distance?" Ethan didn't respond right away. It was as if he was struggling with his own thoughts, fighting an internal battle. Finally, he exhaled. "I don't know." Lucy felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Maybe you should figure it out," she said, voice trembling, "before it's too late." She turned and walked out of the room, leaving Ethan standing alone. That night, there was a quiet knock on her door. Lucy hesitated before answering. "Can I come in?" Ethan's voice was low, uncertain. She nodded, still hurt from their earlier conversation. Ethan sat down in a chair near the window, his posture tense, his expression more vulnerable than she'd ever seen. "I'm not good at this, Lucy," he admitted. "I never have been." Lucy looked at Ethan, silently waiting for him to continue. "But I want to try," he finally said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "I want to be a real father to him." A wave of relief and emotion washed over Lucy. "Then start now, Ethan," she said, meeting his gaze. "Show me you're capable." He nodded, and for a long moment, they just looked at each other, sharing an unspoken understanding. That night, Lucy couldn't sleep. At this stage in her pregnancy, the physical discomfort was already making rest difficult. But beyond that, the emotions swirling inside her were impossible to ignore. The baby's movements were constant, a reminder of how close she was to giving birth. She still felt uncertain about what would happen once he arrived, how things would change, how Ethan would handle it all. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed more determined than ever. Since their conversation, since admitting that he wanted to be a real father, he had become more involved, more present. He was genuinely making an effort, and yet Lucy could tell there were still doubts he hadn't fully confronted. The next morning, Lucy was in the living room when a sudden sharp pain shot through her abdomen. She gasped, grabbing the arm of the sofa to steady herself. Then the pain returned, stronger this time. Stephanie, passing through the hallway, noticed the tension on Lucy's face and rushed over. "Lucy, what's wrong?" she asked, concern filling her voice. Lucy clutched her stomach, trying to breathe through the discomfort. I think it's time," she managed to say, between gasps. Stephanie didn't waste a second. She called for Ethan, who appeared almost instantly, already gripping his car keys. "We're going to the hospital." "Now," he said firmly, leaving no room for debate. The drive to the hospital was tense. Lucy was trying to manage both the pain and the overwhelming fear of what was coming. Ethan kept his eyes on the road, his expression calm, but Lucy noticed his knuckles turning white as he gripped the steering wheel. "It's going to be okay, Lucy," he said, his voice steady but strained. He was trying to reassure her, though she suspected he needed the reassurance just as much. She nodded, but the words stuck in her throat. As soon as they arrived, the medical team took over. Lucy was quickly wheeled into the delivery room, while Ethan tried to follow, only to be stopped by the nurses. "She needs to get prepped first, Mr. Carter. Please wait here," one of them instructed before disappearing through the doors. Ethan stood in the hallway, his heart pounding in a way he wasn't used to. For the first time in his life, he had absolutely no control. Hours passed before a doctor finally emerged. "The delivery is progressing. You can go in now." Ethan didn't hesitate. Inside, he found Lucy exhausted but determined. "You're here," she said, surprised to see him. "Of course I am," he replied, moving closer and taking her hand. The delivery was intense, a blur of pain, emotion, and anticipation. Then, finally, the sharp cry of a newborn filled the room. A wave of relief and happiness washed over Lucy. The doctor held up the tiny baby, turning to both of them with a smile. "Congratulations. It's a healthy baby boy?" Ethan stood frozen, staring at the baby with an expression Lucy had never seen before. He looked lost, almost vulnerable. When the doctor gently placed the baby in Lucy's arms, tears streamed down her face. He was small, perfect, and so fragile. "He's beautiful," she whispered, glancing at Ethan. Ethan stepped closer, looking at the baby in her arms. "Yes, he is," he murmured, his voice quieter than usual. Later, as Lucy rested, a nurse approached Ethan. "Would you like to hold him?" she asked, gently offering the baby. Ethan hesitated. He stared at the tiny figure, wrapped in a soft blanket, looking so delicate, so breakable. "I've never done this before," he admitted, glancing at Lucy. "No one is born knowing how," she reassured him with a tired smile. Carefully, Ethan reached out, cradling the baby in his arms. A warmth spread through him, something he couldn't explain. He had spent his entire life building an empire, making ruthless decisions, controlling every variable in his world. And yet here in his arms was something completely out of his control, something that, for the first time, made him feel whole. Lucy watched as his expression softened in a way she had never seen before. "Lucy," he said, his voice low but steady, "I want you to stay." Lucy frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Ethan took a deep breath before meeting her eyes. "I don't want you to leave when the contract ends. I want you to stay here, with him, with me." Lucy was silent, stunned. Was he really saying this? "Ethan, are you sure?" His grip on the baby tightened slightly as he looked down at his son. "Absolutely. I can't imagine raising him without you." Tears welled in Lucy's eyes. She had never expected this, never imagined Ethan Carter, the man who once treated everything as a transaction, would choose this, choose them. "I don't want to leave either," she finally whispered. In the days that followed, Ethan and Lucy returned to the mansion with their baby boy, whom they decided to name Oliver. Everything had changed. The tension, the distance, the uncertainty that had once defined their relationship. It was gone. Ethan had transformed in a way Lucy never thought possible. She watched as he took on fatherhood with a seriousness and dedication that surprised even himself. He insisted on getting up in the middle of the night to soothe Oliver. He asked questions, learned things he never cared to know before, and for the first time, let go of control in favor of simply being there. One evening, as Ethan rocked Oliver to sleep, Lucy leaned against the doorway, watching him with a quiet smile. "You're doing a good job," she said softly. Ethan looked up, a rare, genuine smile appearing on his face. "I'm learning." Lucy realized that the Ethan she had met in the beginning was no longer the same man. He was still determined, still meticulous, but now there was something more, something deeper. There was love. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden with Oliver, Ethan reached for Lucy's hand and looked into her eyes. "Lucy, I want to make this official," he said. She blinked, confused. "Make what official?" Ethan pulled a small box from his pocket, flipping it open to reveal a simple but elegant ring. "I want you in my life forever," he said. "Not just as Oliver's mother, but as my wife." Tears welled in Lucy's eyes. She had never expected this. Not from Ethan. "Ethan, are you serious?" "I've never been more serious in my life," he replied, his voice steady. Lucy looked at him, truly seeing the man he had become. He wasn't perfect. He still had his flaws, his need for control, but he was trying, and that meant everything to her. A slow smile spread across her face as she whispered, "Yes, I want to stay." Ethan smiled, cupping her face before leaning in to kiss her. For the first time, Lucy felt she was exactly where she belonged. The weeks following Oliver's birth were a whirlwind. Lucy and Ethan adjusted to their new roles as parents, and while there were plenty of joyful moments, not everything was perfect. Despite the changes in him, Ethan still struggled with his instinct to control everything. One morning, as he stood by Oliver's crib, watching him sleep, Lucy sighed. "You need to let me handle this, Ethan," she said gently. "I know you want to be involved, but sometimes it feels like you're trying to do everything yourself." Ethan crossed his arms. "I'm just making sure everything goes right. I want the best for him." "I know that," Lucy said, "but that doesn't mean you have to oversee every little detail. Parenting isn't a business strategy, Ethan." He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. I don't want to make mistakes. I don't want to be like my father." Lucy stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "Ethan, you've already proven you're nothing like him, but you have to trust me more. We're in this together." Ethan didn't reply, but Lucy could see the conflict in his expression. Her words were sinking in. Despite the occasional tension, they were finding their rhythm. Lucy was beginning to feel at home in the mansion, and her relationship with Ethan continued to evolve in ways she never could have imagined. But then, everything took a sudden turn. Lucy's phone rang. It was the hospital. Her heart pounded as she answered. "Ms. Scott," the doctor's voice came through. "Your mother's condition has worsened. We recommend you come immediately." Lucy felt the ground shift beneath her. Without a second thought, she grabbed Oliver and called for Ethan. He didn't hesitate. He dropped everything. "Let's go," he said, grabbing the car keys. At the hospital, Grace looked even more fragile than before. Lucy sat beside her bed, gripping her mother's hand tightly. "Mom, I'm here," she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. Grace's eyes fluttered open. She looked at Lucy first, then at Ethan, who stood nearby holding Oliver. A faint smile formed on her lips. "You've done well, my daughter," she murmured, her voice weak but full of warmth. "You've found someone who truly cares." Tears streamed down Lucy's face. "I just want you to get better, Mom," she choked out. Grace squeezed Lucy's hand with what little strength she had left. "You and this baby are my greatest joy," she whispered. "And now, I can rest peacefully, knowing you have a family." Lucy tried to respond, but her throat tightened. Then, Grace's eyes closed. A long, steady beep echoed from the monitor. The doctor entered the room, but Lucy already knew. Her mother was gone. The days that followed were some of the hardest of Lucy's life. The void Grace left behind felt unbearable. But through it all, Ethan never left her side. He held her, comforted her, supported her in ways she had never expected. "You don't have to go through this alone," he told her one night as he wrapped his arms around her. Lucy looked up at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." Losing Grace changed something in Lucy. It made her realize just how precious the life she had now was. Ethan, Oliver, their family. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. But there was still one thing she needed to know. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Lucy finally voiced the question that had been weighing on her heart. "Ethan, now that my mom is gone, I keep wondering, what happens to us?" Ethan placed Oliver in his crib before sitting beside her. "What do you mean?" Lucy took a deep breath. "I want to know if what we're building here is real. Are we a real family, or are we just two people brought together by circumstance?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he took her hand. "Lucy, I know this started as a contract," he admitted, "but it's not like that anymore." She looked at him, surprised by his honesty. "It's not?" "No," he said, his voice steady. "You and Oliver mean everything to me now. I never thought I'd say this, but you're my family." Lucy felt tears sting her eyes, but this time, they were tears of relief, of happiness. "So what happens now?" she whispered. Ethan smiled, the kind of smile that was filled with certainty. "Now, we move forward, together." As the months passed, Lucy and Ethan only grew closer. Oliver was thriving, and life at the mansion finally felt like home. But Ethan still had one last surprise. One evening, he led Lucy out to the garden, where a table had been set under the stars, lit with candles, surrounded by flowers. Lucy frowned, confused. "What's all this?" she asked as Ethan guided her to the table. He smirked slightly. "Just something I wanted to do." They had dinner, sharing soft laughter and stolen glances. Then, as the meal ended, Ethan stood. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small box. Lucy's heart raced. "Ethan?" He opened the box, revealing a sparkling ring. "I meant what I said before," he told her, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I want forever with you, Lucy." She gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "I want to marry you." Lucy felt her heart pound as she looked at Ethan. his eyes filled with emotions she had never seen so openly before. "Lucy, you've changed my life in ways I never expected," he said, his voice steady but full of sincerity. "You've made me a better man, a better father. Now, I want to be more than that." He got down on one knee and opened a small box, revealing a stunning ring. "Lucy Scott, will you marry me?" Tears streamed down her face as she brought a hand to her mouth. "Ethan, of course I will." As he slid the ring onto her finger, he pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her as if he never wanted to let go. The day of Lucy and Ethan's wedding arrived like a soft breeze, carrying with it the promise of a fresh beginning. The mansion had been transformed into a breathtaking scene, with delicate lights twinkling among the trees and flowers arranged with meticulous care. The golden glow of the setting sun bathed the garden in warm hues, as a small group of loved ones gathered for the intimate outdoor ceremony. In her room, Lucy stood before a mirror, gazing at her reflection. Her simple white gown hugged her figure elegantly, a lace veil draping softly over her shoulders. She reached up, adjusting the necklace her mother had given her years ago. A wave of emotion swept over her. She was about to marry the man she had once thought she could never love. Stephanie entered the room with a warm smile. "You look stunning, Lucy. Ethan is going to be speechless when he sees you." Lucy smiled, her eyes welling up with tears. "I don't even know how to thank you for everything you've done, Stephanie," she said, her voice trembling. Stephanie took her hands gently. "There's no need to thank me. You deserve this happiness, and so does Ethan." Lucy took a deep breath, wiping away a stray tear before it could smudge her makeup. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. Ethan stood at the altar, dressed in a flawless suit. On the surface, he appeared calm and composed, but inside, he felt a rush of emotions he hadn't experienced before: nervousness, excitement, anticipation. Then, the music began. As Lucy stepped into view, walking down the aisle with a close friend by her side, time seemed to slow. She was radiant. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt a profound sense of clarity. Everything in his past, every mistake, every struggle, had led him to this moment. Their eyes met, and in that instant, there were no doubts. Only love. When she finally reached the altar, the officiant began the ceremony with a smile. "Today, we celebrate a love that began in the most unexpected way," he said warmly, looking at the couple. Lucy and Ethan exchanged vows, their words simple yet deeply meaningful. "Lucy," Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "you walked into my life and changed everything I thought I knew about love and family. I promise to be the best man, the best father, and the best partner I can be for you, every single day." Lucy blinked back tears as she spoke. "Ethan, you've shown me that even the most guarded hearts can open. You've given me a home, a family, and a reason to believe. Again. I promise to stand by your side through every joy, every challenge, as we build our future together." As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the guests erupted into applause. Ethan pulled Lucy into a kiss, sealing their promises to each other. The reception was intimate, filled with warmth and laughter. Lucy held Oliver in her arms, smiling as she greeted guests. Ethan stood beside her, looking more at peace than she had ever seen him. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to prove. He had found something that no amount of money could buy: a family. As they danced under the stars, Ethan leaned in and whispered against Lucy's ear, "Thank you for believing in me, even when I didn't deserve it." Lucy smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "You do deserve this, Ethan, and so much more." In the months that followed, life settled into a peaceful rhythm. Lucy and Ethan found ways to give back, using their resources to help families in need, drawing inspiration from their own journey. The mansion, which had once felt like a cold, distant place, was now a home filled with love and laughter. Oliver thrived, surrounded by warmth and joy. One afternoon, as they played with their son in the garden, Ethan turned to Lucy, a soft smile on his face. "You know, I never thought life would be like this," he admitted. "Like what?" Lucy asked, curious. "So simple, so perfect," he said. "I spent so much of my life trying to control everything, planning every detail, but it wasn't until I let go that everything finally fell into place." Lucy reached up, gently brushing her fingers against his cheek. Sometimes, all we need to do is let life surprise us. A few months later, Lucy discovered she was pregnant again. This time, there were no contracts, no expectations, no fears, just happiness. Pure, unquestionable happiness. Ethan was overjoyed, throwing himself even more into fatherhood, fully embracing every moment with Lucy and Oliver. One night, as they tucked their son into bed, Lucy turned to Ethan and whispered, "You've become an incredible man, Ethan." He pulled her into a tender embrace, pressing a soft kiss against her forehead. "That's because of you, Lucy," he murmured. "You showed me what truly matters." When their daughter Emily was born, Ethan, once the man who had struggled to express emotion, held her in his arms and wept. Lucy knew then, without a doubt, that this was the man she wanted to spend the rest of her life with. Years later, Lucy and Ethan sat in the garden, watching their 3 children, Oliver, Emily, and their youngest Noah, laugh and play. Their home was no longer just a place. It was filled with memories, love, and a future they had built together. Ethan turned to Lucy, taking her hand in his. "If I could go back in time," he said, "I'd do it all over again. Every mistake, every challenge, because it all led me here." Lucy smiled, leaning in to kiss him softly. "And I'd do it all over again too," she whispered, "because every moment had been worth it." As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the garden, Ethan and Lucy sat hand in hand, feeling nothing but gratitude. Life hadn't been perfect, but it had been real. They had found what they had been searching for all along: love, a family, a home. Do you think Lucy made the right choice in forgiving and marrying Ethan? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow more incredible stories. If you loved this one, check out more heartfelt stories by clicking here on the end screen.